Welcome into another edition of the No Pope podcast. Alongside me, Nico and Hudson Ridley. I'm Max Gifford, and boys, thanks for coming on today.
Of course, happy to be here. Hudson and I are looking forward to discussing some college football. Max, thanks for having us.
Of course.
It's going to be a great day.
We're in week 6 now of college football, just about halfway there. And let's just get right into stuff. So my first question for you boys is, we're talking ACC Coastal. Who is the best team right now? And, you know, we can touch on all the teams in the Coastal, and then we'll kind of figure out who's the best.
Yeah. Well, so far, in my opinion, I mean, the ACC Coastal, basically in everybody's opinion too, has been a fairly weak division this year so far. I mean, we had Pitt starting off good in the rankings, and they even kept it close with Tennessee. But my team at the top of the ACC Coastal has to be North Carolina right now. Their defense is absolutely atrocious, I understand, but they're led by Drake May right now. He is 7th in the country in passing yards with 1,594. He also has 19 touchdowns, which is tied for first, and only 1 interception. So that's what leads me to believe that North Carolina right now is at the top of the Coastal, even though it's kind of by default because it's a pretty weak division.
I like your choice, Hudson. I got to go NC number 2. My number 1 is going to be Duke.
Oh, little basketball
action, you know. Duke and Kansas this year, I know they have matchups all the time in basketball, and here they are playing each other in football and doing decent this year. But Duke, in my opinion, they beat Temple, Northwestern, North Carolina, A&T, of course. The difference is, yes, they lost to Kansas 35-27, but they beat Virginia 38-17. Syracuse barely edged over Virginia in that one. NC would be my next up, strictly because of the strength of schedule. They had close wins over Appalachian State, Georgia State, lost to Notre Dame 45-32. However, they beat Virginia Tech 41-10. So both teams, I think, right there neck and neck. It could go either way, Duke and North Carolina.
All right, so very good choices. You know, obviously, I would call it pretty basic answers. North Carolina and Duke as far as ACC Coastal goes. And I'm going to kind of switch up it says who's the best team in the ACC Coastal. It doesn't say right now. So I'm looking sort of into the future right now. I'm looking into the future schedule. Okay. I'm looking at the Miami Hurricanes. And I know what you're going to say. They lost to Middle Tennessee last week. Yes, it's not a great look. Not a great look. However, I don't even think it was the worst loss in their conference this week. We look at what was it? Was it Pitt that lost to Georgia State?
Losing to Georgia Tech.
Or Georgia Tech, not Georgia State, Georgia Tech. And that team has been abysmal this year. So, and, you know, we look into the future of Miami. You know, obviously, great recruiting class coming up in the future. But I look at their schedule down the gauntlet. They don't have that much. You know, they'll play Clemson close to the last week. We'll see how they do this week against North Carolina and Duke. So they'll have ways to prove themselves if they're able to come out on top. But I think look at Miami as the best team in the ACC Coastal. I'm not saying right now, you know, 2-2 start, not the best, definitely not the ideal start that Miami wanted, but I think they are on the rise.
I like that pick. I think another way we could look at this, if we ask this question in 2 or 3 weeks from now, I think we'd have a clearer answer. Just because of the games that are coming up. I mean, Miami plays Duke 2 weeks from now. Of course, they play North Carolina this Saturday. They have a couple matchups against Virginia Tech, Virginia. So all of the ACC play is just beginning to roll around. So I think if this question is asked in 2 or 3 weeks, it'd be a little easier to answer. But right now, North Carolina, Duke, and Miami. Yeah. I like all the picks. I think they're all fair.
The way that I see it, like you said, once it gets like 2 or 3 weeks down the line, we'll be able to kind of figure things out a little more. The reason that I don't particularly like either of your squads, I mean, Miami losing to Middle Tennessee State at home is fairly pathetic. And then for Duke, it's more of a strength of schedule issue. And you could say the same thing with North Carolina, even though North Carolina's schedule looks a lot better. Duke barely beat Northwestern. They hung on at home. Northwestern fumbled it into the end zone for Duke to end up winning that game. Like, it was a pretty pathetic game for Duke. So, and Northwestern recently lost to Southern Illinois. So, I mean, if you look at the big scheme of things, Duke, their strength of schedule, even though they have played an undefeated Kansas, it doesn't line up with the strength of schedule of North Carolina, and neither of us, or any of us for that matter, mentioned Pitt. Pitt, what do we think?
No.
No?
No Pitt. I think especially because that loss to Georgia Tech, especially with them firing their coach recently, I just don't see any way that they move up in the standings right now. What are they at? They're 3-2 on the year, 0-1 in conference play, and I don't really see it getting better for them as it goes down. Their schedule is going to be pretty similar to Duke and North Carolina coming up. They're going to have to play both those teams eventually. I just don't see them coming out on top.
Yeah, their next 3 weeks. Tough wins if they can pull them out. Virginia Tech, Louisville, and North Carolina. So
I will ask you, though, Hudson. Yeah. North Carolina, who have they played?
North Carolina.
App State.
Formerly ranked App State, I believe.
That is correct.
I think they made it into
Georgia State, a struggling Notre Dame team, lost at home nonetheless.
Hey, Notre Dame's starting to figure it out.
At the end of the day, Notre Dame is Notre Dame.
Florida A&M and Virginia Tech.
Virginia Tech, not the best team.
So I'm going to flip the strength of schedule on you now. But I will say this week they'll be at Miami, and I think this would be a good indication of if North Carolina is the real deal, and if Miami can get out of the hole that they're currently in. Because if not, they definitely need to start waving the red flag. It could be trouble.
To Hudson's point, though, like it wasn't a small win over Virginia Tech. I mean, they beat them by 31. So there could be something there. I still got to go Duke. I think all three of ours are fair. They could go any direction, especially a couple weeks from now.
All right. So where do you think that your team ends up in the ACC Atlantic division?
Absolutely pathetic. I mean, with all that hype I gave to Drake May in North Carolina, I still think they'd finish around 7th in the ACC Atlantic. I mean, the difference between the Atlantic and the Coastal is absolutely massive. It's kind of the difference you see between the Big Ten East and the Big Ten West.
Yeah,
I mean, the disparity is huge. So even though I like North Carolina's offense, their defense is pretty pathetic. Even though I like their offense, I still think they finish 7th, maybe at absolute maximum 7th in the Atlantic.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm only seeing 2 teams in this Atlantic division. I'm seeing Boston College and Louisville are the only teams that could possibly finish below are Duke, North Carolina, or Miami.
Exactly.
But other than that, yeah, Clemson, Syracuse, Florida State, and Wake Forest. Oh, and NC State, I didn't. It has them a little low right now because they're 0-1 in conference play, but they're still top team in the nation right now. I don't see them going away anytime soon.
No, I got to go the same range as Hudson. I think Duke would be number 6. But like Max, you just said, I don't think they've had the competition that NC State's had, that Florida State's had, that Wake Forest has had. There's just 2 separate divisions between the Coastal and the Atlantic. The talent is just night and day.
I mean, yeah, not just the talent, the coaching.
The coaching, yeah.
I mean, just on all levels. The ACC, like, the split between it is insane. And come ACC championship time, we're going to see a blowout no matter what team is in.
Yeah.
So, moral of the story is just get rid of the ACC Coastal, and the ACC championship game should only be between ACC Atlantic teams.
Agreed.
All right, so let's transition to a different conference. We're going to the Big 12 now.
Ooh, Big 12 country.
And Big 12 obviously hosting game day this week in Lawrence, Kansas. So
that's right.
Exciting stuff for the Jayhawks. But I'm going to ask you guys, who's your favorite team and who's the best team you think in the Big 12?
Well, right now, I mean, the best team in the Big 12, I don't even think it's close, in my opinion. It's got to be Oklahoma State, right? Oklahoma State this year, they're top 10 in the rankings right now. I mean, like, they're 4-0. They had a 36-25 win over ranked Baylor. I mean, they need a little bit more of a challenge because we don't know who's for real in the Big 12 so far. But honestly, we'll hear this a little later. I think they might have a shot at the playoffs.
I can see that too. My pick is Oklahoma State as well. My number 2 pick would be TCU. So, Oklahoma State wins over Baylor, like you just mentioned. Rest of their schedule is whatever. They beat Arizona State, who, by the way, not been their year. Beat them 34-17. So, let's take a look. Oklahoma State plays TCU next Saturday. I think those 2 teams have been some of the best in the Big 12. I think it'll come down to that game. As of now, both undefeated. Oklahoma State ranked 7th, TCU ranked 17th. It's going to be a great matchup next Saturday, but you can't look past this game this weekend, Texas Tech for Oklahoma State. That could go either way as well. So
I'm shocked that both of you ignored both teams in the Sunflower State. We're talking Kansas and Kansas State. And I will say, Big 12 making some noise this season. You look at the top 25 rankings, I believe you have 4 teams in the top 25 right now. You have Kansas, Kansas State, TCU, and Oklahoma State. But I think Kansas and Kansas State could very well make some noise. And I think, you obviously talked about TCU this week at Kansas. That'll be a good indication of if Kansas is really legit. I'm going to be honest, I haven't been too high on Kansas just because I think, first couple of games, to a point, it doesn't mean that much, especially when you get into the conference play. But I think we'll be able to get a good idea against TCU this weekend. But, yeah, it's definitely going to be a battle down the gauntlet. But I think we're going to see one of these teams emerge as victorious over the other. Because I looked at all their schedules with Kansas, Kansas State, TCU, and Oklahoma State. They'll all end up playing each other before the end of the season. I don't see each of them, beating up on each other. I see one team coming out victorious in all of those matches.
I think you're right. I think part of our problem, too, is what we saw in our debate on the ACC Coastal. Strength of schedule is playing a massive factor here, right? The strength of schedule we thought was good for Kansas State because they beat Oklahoma, and TCU because they beat Oklahoma. But at the same time, Oklahoma's been terrible this year. So it's tough to tell who is the real deal. Kansas, they don't have a great strength of schedule so far. So, to your point, it is a little bit difficult to tell. And in about 2 or 3 weeks, we'll start seeing who is for real and who isn't once they start to play more ranked teams down the schedule, once the web starts to connect of college football a little more. Because it feels a little isolated right now in between, some teams will have really easy strengths of schedules, and then eventually they'll tank, and new ones will come up. So we'll see what happens with Kansas and Kansas State. But I do like Kansas State a lot. I think their win over Oklahoma was really impressive. I don't think they get enough credit for that. And TCU as well, I'm just not super high on Kansas this year. Even though they're undefeated, everybody loves Kansas. In my personal opinion, I don't have a lot of faith.
I think you can make a valid point on all 4 of those teams, like we've all talked about. Tomorrow, TCU, Kansas, so there's another close matchup. Let's bring in a 5th team, the Texas Longhorns. Thoughts? Okay, one loss,
I can already hear them in the control room. They're already growing at that answer.
I'm not saying this is my team by any means, but 1-point loss against Alabama a few weeks ago. We were watching that game together. Tremendous game. Obviously, they fell short in the end. Yes, they lost to Texas Tech by 3 in overtime. But it's one of those teams that on any given week, they can make a change. They can get back into those rankings. They can kind of switch things up for other teams in the same conference. So thoughts on Texas?
I've got 2 words for you. Okay. Horns down.
Oh my goodness.
I don't see the appeal to Texas. I feel like there's the hype around them every single year.
Every year, I agree.
And then eventually, they squeak into the top 25. They're finally ranked, and then they have a tough loss like Texas Tech.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
So, as much as I want to say that, Texas is on the rise, I feel like I've said that every year in the past decade. But I just have a feeling that, every time they get there, they feel like, all right, now we can relax. We finally made the top 25.
I think the thing about Texas is, like you said, they're always in these games because they recruit so well. And I think a lot of it is we have to focus on the health of Quinn Ewers, right? When he was in that Alabama game, he was the one making those plays and keeping them in it. One of the greatest recruits we've seen out of high school had a perfect recruiting ranking out of high school. I believe he played at Westlake in Texas, which is a fantastic football school. So with all those things on top of him, with a great recruiting class every single year, I'm not the biggest fan of Steve Sarkisian, but sometimes he's able to figure it out. So for those reasons, you can never really count Texas out. Are they back? By no means are they back. Will they ever be back? By no means will they ever be back. But sometimes Texas can be in the conversation.
Exactly.
And I think that's an interesting point to bring up, Nico.
That's all I'm saying. One of these years it's going to click and something's going to change.
I would say take away all our points. Can we recognize the fact that we're not talking about Oklahoma, Baylor, or Iowa State in this conversation? The fact that they've dropped so far this year just haven't been impressive at all this season.
Yeah, in my opinion, Baylor, a good start to the year. I believe they dropped a game to BYU, though, which BYU, still a top 25 team, but it's a bit of a tough loss considering that not a Power 5 opponent. They have good moments, but at the end of the day, it is BYU. So, I mean, Baylor's an interesting case where I think they're a great team, and I think they can beat a team like Kansas or Kansas State, maybe even TCU. But in the long run of things, I don't think Baylor has the punching power to stick with Oklahoma State. I mean, I mentioned earlier, Oklahoma State did beat them by double figures, even if it was only by 11, but double figures still. So I don't think Baylor has the bite to hang with the big dogs, even though there is one big dog in the Big 12 right now.
It's interesting to see really how this Big 12 conference has flipped the script. I mean, Kansas and Kansas State all these years have been rock bottom. And now you look, they're 1-2 at the moment. It's just interesting to see how college football can change, and that's why fans stay interested. So,
all right, well, we're going to stay on the Big 12, but I'm going to talk a little something different. Okay. We're talking CFP. Ooh. We're talking college football playoff. And here, I'm going to run you guys through my logic, and then I'm going to let you guys sort of finish. So I would say right now, if the trends continue, if their winning ways continue, 3 or 4 teams should be Alabama, Georgia, and whoever wins that Ohio State-Michigan game.
Agreed.
Yes.
Your 4th team. Does the winner of the Big 12 get that 4th spot?
I think it's all dependent on how well Clemson does this year, right? Clemson currently sitting at that number 5 spot, and it looks like they could win out in the ACC. But if they catch a snag, I think there's a chance for Oklahoma State, who can go undefeated for the rest of the year. I think they match up well with every single team on the rest of their schedule. If they can go undefeated and Clemson drops one of these games, possibly even to Syracuse, probably not, but possibly. If Clemson is able to drop one of these games, Oklahoma State can sneak in there and take that 4th spot, but we do know what happens with that 4th spot. Unless it's Ohio State in, 2013? Unless it's Ohio State in 2013, you're going to get smashed.
So my short answer is no. My short answer is no.
No faith in the Big 12.
We have Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State. Who's going to be that 4th team? USC, possibility. Clemson, like you just mentioned. I don't see an Oklahoma State falling into that 4th spot unless a Clemson or a USC were to lose to some unranked team. Washington State, in my opinion, underrated team. USC matches up against them tomorrow. Potential upset, I don't know. USC still has to face Utah. They got Notre Dame, UCLA. So not an easy schedule from here on out for USC. But no, I don't think a Big 12 team will make that 4th spot.
I'm going to kind of use your argument to kind of agree with Hudson here, because I look at these top 25 rankings. I look at Clemson. I look at USC. I look at Tennessee. I look at Ole Miss. I look at Penn State. Those are the remaining teams in the top 10 who aren't those top 4 and who aren't Oklahoma State. I think all of those guys easily have harder schedules than Oklahoma State down the stretch.
Good point, too.
I will say, I'm going to agree with Hudson, it's going to take Oklahoma State being undefeated to be able to get to that 4th spot.
I think that's a no-brainer.
You're going to have Ole Miss and Tennessee. They're both going to have to see Alabama or Georgia by the end of the season. And, obviously, if one of those falls in their favor, maybe they move up and they're in the conversation and Georgia's out of the conversation. But I do think that USC has a tough schedule down the stretch. I think Clemson has a tough schedule down the stretch. We just talked for what feels like 10 minutes about how hard that ACC Atlantic is, and I'm kind of on Hudson train. We might add a little Pulp into this podcast, but I do think Syracuse could come on top against Clemson in Death Valley.
So at the same point, though, to your strength of schedule, Oklahoma State faces off against Texas Tech tomorrow. We could have a different answer tomorrow night, depending on the outcome of that game. Oklahoma State still has to face TCU, still has to face Texas. We just talked about how they're never a team that's out of it. Kansas State, Kansas. So after looking at strength of schedules, I think it's pretty equal between USC and Oklahoma State. Who will not lose pretty much? I think that's the question.
I think the differentiator is with USC that Utah is going to beat USC.
Yes.
I'm saying that right now. Utah will beat USC. I love Cam Rising at Utah. I think they had a tough start to the year by losing to Florida. But I think they really have potential. I mean, I loved watching Utah last year.
Oh, yeah.
And watching them again this year, I mean, that game against that Rose Bowl against Ohio State last year, when Cam Rising really got his feet under him, I mean, just an incredible game. So for those reasons, I mean, I think USC, they're going to fall to Utah. In Utah, I believe. I mean,
I think it is in Utah.
And
it is in Utah.
I mean, Oklahoma State, leapfrog them.
Speaking
With a Clemson loss, that number 4 spot might be calling.
Yeah. Speaking of that Rose Bowl, I was in attendance.
Oh.
I was in attendance. One of the best college football games, of course. Utah, Ohio State. Ohio State edged out, but Cam Rising, that guy's got a bright future.
He's incredible.
I will say we learned with the people, with the CFP people, that if you're undefeated, you have a good chance. We saw that with Cincinnati last year.
Exactly.
So if any of these teams get a loss, I think Ohio State's right in that 4th spot. Because I think we've kind of established, as long as you win, you have a good chance of getting in.
Yes.
All right, moving on. I think you guys already touched on it a little. We were talking about the USC Trojans.
We were.
So you're thinking Utah to down them. Nico, you were talking about Washington State a little.
I was.
Can you bring that up?
Sure. So Washington State, I think they're one of the most underrated teams in college football. They're just one spot outside the top 25 right now, received 91 votes this week. Let's talk about red zone offense and defense, because that is all Washington State. That's why, in my opinion, they could pull off an upset against USC. So, yes, I'm high on USC. Yes, I'm high on Washington State. Of course, one of them is going to lose in the next couple of weeks. Who will it be? I don't know. But Washington State, I don't think many people are talking about them enough.
I agree with you. They're a team that I have on my radar as well. They're a team that I put down as an underrated team going into today. However, I think there's a difference between Utah being able to hang with USC and possibly beat them and Washington State, right? Washington
I agree
State,
with that too.
They don't have what it takes to beat USC. There's always this kind of every given Saturday mentality, which, you can
Texas,
maybe get something. Yeah, like a Texas kind of thing where you might be able to upset a team, but I don't think Washington State has the ability to hang with the weapons, just the pure offensive weapons of USC, which is why Washington State, even though they're outside the top 25, they're going to do good enough to kind of stay in that area, but I don't think they're going to rise much from where they are.
So before we get back to you, Max, bottom question: who has the best chance of upsetting USC? You talked about Utah. That's your pick, right?
Oh yeah.
Okay, my pick. I think Utah is a very good pick, but will it come down to Thanksgiving weekend Notre Dame beating USC
in South Bend?
No, it is in Los Angeles.
It's in LA.
Yes.
Will Notre Dame just work their magic after this chaotic year, to say the least, and beat USC to destroy their CFP chances?
No home crowd advantage for USC.
Exactly.
Because no one shows up.
No one shows up.
Yes.
So I'm just throwing that out there. I'm just throwing that out there.
Part of me, honestly, wants to jump on the Washington State train.
Okay.
This will be their 3rd ranked opponent that they face this season. They played Wisconsin, played Oregon last week, or was it last week? They played,
yes.
Yes, they played, or 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago.
Lost to Oregon by a field goal. So coming into an opposing stadium with a ranked opponent doesn't scare Washington State right now. No. I think they're going to have the mindset, especially, we talked about without that home crowd advantage. I think Washington State could very well come out on top in this one.
And we know that, as you mentioned, they went into Wisconsin and beat Wisconsin. Now, Wisconsin, we know they're not a good team now. At the time, we thought they were. But we mentioned that home crowd advantage.
Exactly. It's still
Camp
Wisconsin.
Randall is incredible. Jump around, right? It's insane. USC, who knows how many people are going to be there?
Yeah.
Couple thousand?
I mean, is Washington State jumping around in the top 25 coming up?
Oh,
I don't know.
I don't know.
That might be a later topic.
We
might need to discuss.
So all 3 of us agree Washington State, the team to keep an eye on.
Oh, yes. I would say
I like
so.
that. I like that.
All right, so now we're going to transition to the Big Ten. And I think we discussed this a little when we talked about the CFP, but we said, we have Alabama, Georgia. Obviously, the Big 12 winner will be sneaking in. But then we have the winner of that Ohio State-Michigan game. If they played right now, who do you have winning?
I mean, easily I have to take Ohio State. And I think the reason behind it is the trends of both teams right now. Ohio State, they opened up their year at Notre Dame, and they had, hosting Notre Dame. They had a fairly close game, a lot closer of a game than many people expected. But now, as we look at it down the stretch, I mean, convincing wins over a lot of teams, whereas Michigan, even though they had a strong start to the year, they beat Colorado State and Hawaii and Connecticut. Those 3 teams that they played, horrifically bad at football. Yeah. Just atrocious. Now, once they start playing real competition, even though that real competition is Maryland and Iowa, which aren't 2 good teams. I mean, they barely escaped Maryland with a 7-point victory, and then Iowa, they won by 13, but it's Iowa. So, I mean, Ohio State on the way up, Michigan on the way down, and for that reason, I have to give it to Ohio State.
The Ohio State University.
Yes,
sir. Ohio State, my pick as well. You look at the trends in the past 10 to 15 years. Michigan's only won, I think, twice, I want to say, including last year in Michigan. First of all, let's take a step back. Where's this game being played?
The Shoe.
The Shoe.
The Shoe.
How hard is it to win in the Shoe?
Very tough.
It is hard.
So I think that is 40 to 50% of the pick in there is where the game's located. So it's at the Shoe, right? Michigan hasn't lost in the Shoe, I think, since 2000. So since 2000. Hasn't won in the Shoe since 2000.
Yes,
sorry.
Hasn't won.
The Wolverines have not come to Ohio State
really?
since 2000. Yes. C.J. Stroud, Jackson Smith, and the Jigba when he comes back.
Oh, yeah.
Ohio State, I mean, I think they've got it all in their favor.
So, I mean, can we recognize the fact that they gave up 2 touchdowns to Iowa?
Yeah. I mean, South Dakota State didn't even do that.
Yeah.
And they're South Dakota State.
I don't know if you guys saw the highlights. You know how Iowa has their tradition? They wave to the kids in the children's hospital.
Wave.
So C.J. Stroud struggled a little bit last weekend. Ohio State won 49-10 over Rutgers, but Stroud didn't have the offensive game like he wanted to. Ohio State travels to East Lansing and plays Michigan State tomorrow. Could be, Michigan State hasn't been playing too well, but something to keep an eye on. Those Ohio State-Michigan State matchups, you never know, just like a Michigan. So let's take a look. We've been doing it all day. Take a look at the strength schedule for the Buckeyes. Iowa, okay, I think we're all in agreement. That's a done deal.
Yes.
They go to Penn State.
Happy Valley.
They go to Happy Valley. They go to Happy Valley.
Is that a night game?
To be determined, October 29th. But something to keep an eye on. Ohio State, Penn State. I think we're all going to go Ohio State in this one, but is it a matter of Happy Valley upsetting Ohio State? I don't know.
I mean, Penn State almost dropped one at home to Northwestern.
They did.
Just last week. I mean, that is purely pathetic.
They're still a top 10 college football team.
And you mentioned C.J. Stroud struggling.
So I guess the question that goes into that, hopefully he picks things back up.
Yeah.
But if he does keep falling a little bit, could that lead to a Penn State upset 3 weeks from now if Stroud's unable to keep the momentum he's had all season?
Well, Michigan State is going to be a get-right game for Stroud. Michigan State's secondary is absolutely atrocious. C.J. Stroud may break some records. We're looking to break some records, as Garrett Schrader would say.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I'm looking at this Michigan schedule, and I would argue that their first 3 games might have been arguably the 3 worst teams in college football. You had Colorado State, Hawaii, and UConn. So
hold on now.
So they've beaten 2 teams.
Syracuse just played Wagner.
You have a point, but this is no Pulp. We don't bring up Syracuse.
No, we don't.
This is true, as far as FBS teams go.
But I'm looking down. They'll only play 3 more away games. They'll play at Indiana this weekend. Of course, I think the Hoosiers are going to win because both my parents went to Indiana. But that's besides the point. They'll play at Rutgers in a couple weeks, and then they'll play at the Shoe. The rest of those are at home. They'll end up playing Penn State again. And who knows, maybe we see a Penn State upset on the road. Who else do they play? They'll play Michigan State at home. They'll play Nebraska at home, and they'll play Illinois at home. The funny thing is, if the Fighting Illini were at home, I'd almost pick the Illini in that.
Wow. I mean,
as crazy as that sounds,
I can see it.
We've seen the Illini do crazier things.
Yeah, you know what? I can see it. I'm not a fan of the Illini. I'm not a fan of the way they play football. But they always surprise teams.
Exactly.
The Illini, they're always in games. They're the Texas of the Big Ten, which, well, I mean, that's just sad to say.
Well,
what a confidence killer it would be if the week before Ohio State, they take a loss to Illinois.
Oh, wow. Where would that be?
That would be brutal.
Real quick, here we are talking about Michigan, talking about Penn State. They face each other next weekend. Does Penn State go to Ann Arbor and pull out a win?
I don't see that happening. I'm not extremely high on Michigan. I think I may have made that clear a little bit.
I don't think we're high on either team, to be honest.
But the Big House is also, while I'd argue the shoe is harder to play in, the Big House
also hard
arguably one of the hardest stadiums to play in college football.
But see, the difference is playing in stadiums, it doesn't really affect Big Ten teams and SEC teams as much as it will Pac-12 teams and things like that, because nearly every stadium you go to, especially in the SEC, but most of the stadiums you go to in the Big Ten are still going to be making noise. So, like, the factor, of course, Ann Arbor's going to be super loud. It's a top 10 matchup, but at the same time, I mean, I don't know how much of a factor it's going to play against Penn State. I think Penn State defeats themselves by playing bad football, and Michigan capitalizes on those mistakes that Penn State is going to make and ends up winning this game.
All right. Do we have any more thoughts on Ohio State or Michigan, or are we? I think we've got a pretty good consensus on that.
I have 2 words.
What?
2 words. I'm going to steal your thing here.
Oh,
I'm going to go 2 words.
Go
Bucks.
Oh, okay.
Go Bucks.
Okay.
That's my 2 words.
I see.
Okay, so let's go to another conference with particular high aspirations. We're going to the SEC, but we're not talking about your Georgias, your Alabamas, your Ole Misses, your Tennessees. We're talking about 2 teams that just have squeaked into the top 25. We're talking LSU and we're talking Mississippi State.
Well, I mean, LSU at the beginning of the year, we saw that controversy with Brian Kelly, and it kind of left a bad taste in everybody's mouth. I mean, like, I'm not sure how well his family was treated down there during that time. But in these past few weeks, I'm not saying they're a good team, right? But you start to see a little more confidence in Brian Kelly. I saw an Instagram post the other day from LSU, and it was a Brian Kelly pregame speech, and everybody in the comments was like, find me a brick wall to run through. People are starting to get behind Brian Kelly and kind of not forget, but more forgive the problems that he had at the beginning. Now, are they a for-real team? No. By no means are they a for-real team. But do they have potential? I could see it. As for Mississippi State, I'm still a little cautious on them just for strength of schedule reasons. I mean, they've had some pretty good wins. I mean, they're currently sitting at 4-1, I believe, but I'm just a little cautious on them.
Also, was that a Southern accent when you started that?
Oh.
Were you trying to do your best Brian Kelly imitation?
My best Brian Kelly. I'm excited to be here with my family. Always love that one.
So I'm not sold on either yet. That's my straight up answer. Now they face each other on October 22nd. So we'll see how that goes. Ole Miss, the only notable win they've had is against 13th ranked Kentucky at home, 22-19. So that's a little momentum carry right there. LSU, like you said, Brian Kelly, the whole fiasco at the beginning of the season, things are starting to change a little bit. LSU beat Mississippi State 31-16, one of their limited notable opponents so far. Now, LSU play Tennessee tomorrow. That's a huge game too. Number 25 against number 8. Which direction will that go? I don't know. I'm not sold yet. I think this is another question where 2 to 3 weeks from now we might have a better answer. But LSU, you look at their schedule and it's tough as always. The SEC, never easy. Never a game that you can just look past.
I mean, if you look at this game, Tennessee is going to wallop LSU. I don't think it's going to be close. I think it's going to be over 20-point differential in this game. Tennessee's offense is so potent. I don't care where they go. If they're not playing Alabama or Georgia, then they're going to rain down fire wherever they go. I don't care if it's Death Valley. I don't care if the crowd is going to be rocking. I say Tennessee by 20+. What do you think, Max?
I see that accent you're talking about, by the way. Max.
Oh, yeah. My family.
The first thing I'm going to say is I think you should be on Beat the Bookie. Should I lock in that bet this week, 20+?
I cannot advise that.
You cannot advise that?
I cannot advise that.
I'm going to say I agree with you on the Tennessee point. Tennessee so dominant this season, and LSU a couple of early losses, but you know. Who knows? Maybe Brian Kelly will have something up his sleeve. He pulls an upset. Who knows? But, you know, we're talking about Mississippi State. I'm just looking at they have a gauntlet coming up. They have Arkansas this week, Kentucky next, Alabama next. Then they'll play Auburn. That's okay. Then they'll go Georgia and Ole Miss.
Yeah.
So Mississippi State's definitely going to be able to prove themselves in this stretch.
I don't think they will. Because early in the season, I mean, wins over Memphis and Arizona two programs that are not necessarily the highest caliber. They lost to LSU. They beat Bowling Green, which is a team that people make jokes about because Bowling Green not particularly good either. And then beating Texas A&M used to sound pretty impressive. Not really anymore. This schedule that they have for these next few weeks, I get it, they're ranked 23. I think they drop their next 3 games, and I think they drop 4 out of their last 6, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I would too.
I was going to say that going down the having to play 1, 2, and 9.
Yeah.
Through your four top 15 teams in the country. That's tough, and that's hard to keep a consistent pace.
Yeah, I think out of both of them, I would have to pick LSU. Also, another thing that factors into that is Brian Kelly. I mean, he's not just a college football coach. He's a high-caliber college football coach. That's why LSU brought him in. So let's just backtrack a little bit and always remember that, even though with the tough starts to the season. So LSU would be my pick. A little bit easier schedule. Not that it's easy by any means, but you guys mentioned that Ole Miss schedule to end things is just not looking too hot.
I mean, the talent on LSU is obviously way better than Mississippi State's as well. After that 2019 season, there are very few teams that have recruited better than LSU has. Now, their roster, talent-wise, it's a little bit up and down, and some recruits not living up to expectations. But in the long run, I mean, Mississippi State recruiting has been brutal for them, whereas LSU, it's been looking pretty good. So I think as the schedule gets harder and your talent and hard work are both going to be a factor, I think LSU is going to do much better down the stretch, as you mentioned.
All right, so we're about to wrap it up here, but I want you all, we're going to go outside the top 25. Who's one team that we're not talking about in college football right now? Maybe someone you think that should be in the top 25 right now.
I think we all said Washington State, I think.
We did mention Washington State.
I would go Washington State. That would be my choice. I want to hear yours, though, because you don't sound too optimistic about Washington State.
I do have faith in Washington State. I mean, I like the way that they're playing this year. I'm not too certain.
You think the talent of football there's a line between Washington State and the top 25?
I would say so. I think Washington State is not a real top 25 team. I think they're a solid football team. I think they will make a bowl game, and I think, maybe they'll have a shot at winning whatever, the Idaho Potato Bowl or whatever they end up in. But I think in the long run, I don't particularly like them. I think a team that, even though they just lost a game, I still like Minnesota. Right? I still like Muhammad Ibrahim. They had a rough game against Purdue, and I understand that Purdue is not the best team. But Purdue has received top 25 votes as well. They received 2.
See, I feel like Purdue is kind of in that Texas category. Not the super high, well-known category, but more of like they could beat any team on a given week.
I mean, we saw them beat Ohio State.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying.
Multiple times in the last few years, and as well as number 2 ranked Iowa at the time, I believe. That was last year. So, I mean, Purdue, they're always in it. And, I mean, their loss to Syracuse, now not looking so bad now that Syracuse is 5-0. So, Purdue and Minnesota, this isn't just Big Ten bias. I like both of those teams. And I think, both of those teams have a chance to end up in the top 25 at the end of the year.
I was going to say, with the pace that the Big Ten West is going, I'd say any team could end up in that Big Ten championship game. Because right now it's Illinois that's going to be in the championship game right now. They're 4-1 right now. That's the best record. Or I guess Minnesota is also 4-1. So they're just behind them, but they're also, and everyone is 1-1 in conference play except Wisconsin right now. I'm going to go outside your normal Pac-12 or your Big Ten. We're going to go to the American Conference, and we're going to talk about the Tulane Green Wave. Wow. Okay. Yeah, I heard that. I heard that in the control room. They like that. They like that a lot. So think about this: the last time they were ranked was 1998. It's been well over 20 years since they've been in any sort of ranking talks. They've gotten a couple votes over the years, but never actually made it back into the rankings in this century. Just recently, beat Kansas State on the road. Yeah. They've had 4 wins in 5 tries so far, and now. So you have that win against Kansas State. You have one ranked team, and you're coming off a 3-point win against Houston, so now you've tied your American Conference record alongside Cincinnati. So the question is, does Tulane make that jump and finally squeak into the top 25 for the first time in 23 years? I think it's possible. I think we're also talking about a team that went 2-10 last year. So already performing twice as well as they did last year, already with 4 wins so far this season. But, obviously, strength of schedule plays a result. I mean, these next couple weeks, they'll play East Carolina, South Florida, Memphis, Tulsa, UCF, and their last 2 games will be their hardest against SMU and Cincinnati.
Mm-hmm. I mean, they recently dropped one against Southern Mississippi,
but we don't even mention that one. Everyone loses a game. We talked about Miami. They lost to Middle Tennessee. Everyone loses a game every once in a while.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Tulane, even though you mentioned, I had no idea they hadn't made the top 25 since 1998, because they continually put out NFL talent. I mean, we see Darnell Mooney. He went to Tulane. Cam Sample in the league right now. I believe he's still on the Bengals, defensive lineman. He's been playing pretty well. So, I mean, they have NFL talent on that roster consistently. Hopefully they can pull out a top 25 ranking.
Let me pull out this question. So, Tulane, you mentioned their last match of the year is against Cincinnati, a ranked team at the moment. If they beat them, then there's a legitimate bowl scenario where they might get placed into a better game. Now, here's my question. Can Tulane beat an Arkansas, a Florida State,
no,
a Baylor, a Washington State, a Florida, even a Purdue and Oklahoma? So
that's a person who is a non-believer would say
that's
that.
Where I'm coming from.
I am a true believer in the Tulane Green Wave, and I say roll Green Wave till we die.
All right, Max.
But I would say, very good takes across the board. I think all these teams have a legitimate case at cracking the top 25 eventually. We even talked Minnesota, Purdue could potentially make the Big Ten championship game. Washington State, we'll see this weekend. And Tulane, hopefully they don't blow any games down the stretch like they did their last. But it'll be those last 2 weeks that'll decide whether they are legit. Because I think right now Tulane easily gets a bowl spot. It just matters at the end of the day if they will actually show that they can play in a legit bowl game.
Yeah, I agree with that.
All right, so we're just about wrapping things up.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, I want to know any final thoughts you have, or maybe a game of the week that you want to look forward to.
I mean, game of the week is where game day is right now. Lawrence, Kansas, TCU versus Kansas. This has huge implications for the Big 12. I'm excited to see what happens in that one. Nico?
Same with Tennessee and LSU. Does LSU pull out an upset at home over the Volunteers? We'll see. I think it could be a real possibility. I want to throw one more thing at you guys. One more team. 21st overall, Washington.
See, Washington, I'm a little up and down on them. Don't really know what to believe right now. Good win over Michigan State.
As a partial Hoosiers fan myself, I'm very partial to Michael Penix Jr. But I don't know. Especially with last week, I don't know if I'm high out in Washington anymore. Michael Penix Jr. obviously a disgusting quarterback. He has come back in an insane way, but I just don't see how Washington's defense can deal with their gauntlet that they're going to deal with down the stretch. My game of the week, and I'll say this in the little bit of time we have left.
Tulane?
No, I'm going to go Utah and UCLA.
I like that.
UCLA is going to be at home, but we'll see. Maybe they'll have a home crowd show up, maybe not, but this will be a chance to see if Utah is going to be able to compete in the upcoming weeks with USC. That's all the time we have on No Pulp Podcast. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.